Hot hatchbacks are the true people's champions. They are wolves in sheep's clothing, high-performance vehicles wrapped in sensible family packaging. These are the cars that you turn up to work in and shame your boss's purpose-built sports car in. But life as a hot hatch is pretty difficult. It's a real blood sport with everyone trying to be king of the hill, and that pecking order changes continuously. And that's why we've brought two of the most iconic badges in the hot hatch world, GTI and Type R, together today. Today we've brought together the very latest hot hatches from each, the new Mk8 Golf GTI and the freshly facelifted Civic Type R. Now, before the owners' clubs start raging in the comments about how this is a total mismatch and the Type R has a 74 brake horsepower advantage in this race, you are correct. However, something else to factor in is that the current Golf GTI is more expensive than a Type R. Both are performance-based front-wheel drive hot hatchbacks, so all of a sudden the playing field in terms of value for money becomes a real question that needs to be answered. Now, you may have seen my previous reviews of the Mk8 Type R where I've really sung its praises, but today, to level the playing field, I'm even wearing my GTI socks. Ultimately, what I'm looking for here isn't simply the fastest car. What I want is the car that most firmly ticks that hot hatchback box. Now, we all know that a game of top trumps is largely irrelevant in the real world, but it is the favourite pub game of the sort of people who buy both of these cars. So let's get it out of the way. Both of these hot hatchbacks are powered by a 2-litre turbocharged petrol engine, with the GTI producing 242 brake horsepower and the Type R a substantial 316 brake horsepower. Torque is a bit more even, 370 Nm for the GTI and 400 Nm for the Type R, and combined those produce 0 to 62 figures for the GTI of 6.3 seconds and the Type R of 5.7 seconds. The Mk8 GTI will reach a top speed of 155 miles per hour, whilst the Type R races on to 169 miles per hour. In fact, the only stat the GTI really wins on is most expensive at £33,460 starting, whereas the Type R is £32,820. The Type R in GT trim is exactly £2,000 more expensive, but an equivalently spec GTI is more expensive still. So let's talk interiors, and I've set up base camp in the new Mk8 Golf GTI, and a lot has changed. The cabin of a Golf has always been quite a grown-up environment, but the Mk8 has taken a real step up in terms of how premium it looks. The design with this cascading dashboard and large displays that cocoon the driver is very modern, and it has this real techified feel to it. You'll also notice that much of the switchgear has been absorbed by these haptic feedback buttons. Now, what they are is effectively a flat surface that simulates the prod of the button when you push them, a bit like what the iPhone had a few years ago. And it tidies up the cabin nicely. I think the steering wheel might be festooned with just a few too many of them, but it provides this really nice, clean, slick piano black look to the car. Speaking of switchgear, you might recognise this gear selector here that looks a bit reminiscent of what's on the 992 Porsche 911. I wonder who the parent company is of Porsche. The mature feeling of the cabin is also highlighted with a slight sporty element, things like red mood lighting, and of course these bolstered sports seats with the traditional tartan. They're really nice and supportive and actually very comfortable over longer distances. I have to say the cabin is let down by some material choices. Things like the door cards are made out of what feel like quite scratchy, cheap plastics, which is a bit of a disappointment in an otherwise premium looking cabin. Taking a look at the Civic Type R's interior, and you have to say it's decidedly last generation. The touchscreen infotainment system isn't all that large by today's standards, and frankly, the software on it is just unacceptable by today's standards. It's so clunky, it's not very user-friendly, and its only saving grace is that you can actually use Apple CarPlay with it. I hate to say it, Honda, but they really need to step up their game in this regard. Technology is the new battlefield for any car. Yes, the Type R does have a digital driver's display, but the GTI offers more features and customization. When you sit down and you start pushing and prodding around the cabin, the perceived quality swings in the Type R's favour, because things like the door cards that we've mentioned in the GTI are made of much more durable, sturdy materials. And in that regard, I'd say actually the Type R has a better quality cabin in terms of materials. The Type R also has those big, racy, bolstered seats which add so much theatre to the interior. You know you're in a serious performance hot hatch, whereas the GTI is a bit more refined and a bit more tempered towards driving you home as opposed to around the track. Both cars are plenty practical when it comes to the back row, but I would say the GTI has the edge here because it can seat 3 in its back row as opposed to the 2 of the Civic Type R. But both cars do offer plenty of head and legroom for rear passengers. When it comes to the war for boot space, there's no contest. Whilst the Golf GTI's nice square opening offers plenty of practicality for loading and unloading, simply not as vast as the 420 litres offered in the Civic Type R. Type R actually having one of the biggest boots in its class. Okay, let's kick off with the Type R, and I suppose we're here on home turf for this car, really. A twisty, windy technical circuit with some real greasy patches that are a bit of a challenge in any hot hatchback. And this is where the Type R really excels. All the hardcore bravado on the outside is not just for show. Let's talk engine first, because that 2-litre turbocharged VTEC engine is an absolute peach. Really strong, muscular, torquey engine from right down low in the rev range. And it means that whenever you go down second gear slow corners like this, there's loads of torque to pull you out of the other side. Of course, it's a very different experience from the old high revving VTEC screamers of old, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. In the modern era, those engines couldn't survive anyway, and this is a very good substitute. I mean, for a turbocharged engine, there's very little in the way of turbo lag. It's really responsive, and paired with this absolutely delicious 6-speed manual transmission, it is an utter joy out on the road and on circuit here. But as good as that engine is, it's really the chassis that does the business here, because my goodness, from a driving standpoint, it's incredibly involving. I can feel through the seat of my pants exactly how the chassis is twisting, twitching, slipping, gripping. And it's a really informative, dialed in conversation that I'm having with the car. The steering, like most modern cars, isn't as communicative as you might like, speaking about old school hot hatchbacks, but there's definitely enough there for you to feel how much grip you've got under those front wheels. And it's weighty enough and precise enough for you to absolutely assassinate these apexes through here. Going up through the driving settings of this car up to its pinnacle of plus R mode really unlocks a new level of relentless performance in the Type R. A new torque maps actually apply to the engine, and you can really feel how it just wants to surge itself down these big straights. But then when met with really tough, hard braking zones, those great big Brembo stoppers, now 2-piece floating arrangements in this updated car for better cooling and resilience to brake fade. Oh, it's just absolutely mega. You get hard on the brakes, the car's all up on its toes, the weight sort of shifts forwards, and you can pivot the car quite nicely. We've had the car up on 3 wheels through some of these corners earlier this week, and it's just a hell of a lot of fun. And especially in these greasy conditions, I mean, lift off oversteer is, you know, just a twitch away. It's good fun. It really is good fun. I mean, of course, like with both of these front-wheel drive hot hatchbacks, you have to manage the grip available, manage the power, otherwise you're just going to spin it all away. That's the same with anything that's got a decent amount of performance and is sending it all through the front wheels, especially with sort of sports-orientated tyres on wet, greasy days like today. But as a result, I find both of these a bit more involving than some of their all-wheel drive counterparts, because you've got to do a lot of the work here. A computer isn't dialing out the danger for you. You need to keep on top of the car, and for me, that's something I really enjoy in a performance hatch. Now, clearly the Type R excels on the track, but what about out on the road? Well, you put the car back down into comfort, and actually it's been recalibrated for this facelifted model. Over high frequency bumps, the ride is actually quite acceptable, even with these large alloy wheels and, you know, the sports orientated suspension. Dampers have been programmed to respond a bit faster to bumps in the road. Yeah, big road imperfections like speed bumps and potholes do still send a shudder through the cabin, and I suppose it gives something away there to some of its rivals. There are more refined hot hatchbacks out there, but I wouldn't say that you couldn't live with this. I guess it just comes down to a degree of how forgiving your partner, your children may be of this car, because of course the flip side of the coin is that it's got to be a practical family hatchback at the end of the day. I like that this car comes loaded with standard equipment, reversing cameras that just make your life easier. And yeah, in comfort whenever the throttle's dulled, it's nice to trundle around town in, I have to say. I mean, I'm sure many people will argue that this car has a real image problem. That will come down to personal preference, and I'll leave you guys to argue about that in the comments. But certainly in comparison to this car's predecessor, it is a night and day difference between how easy it is to live with. The Type R does have quite a thick veneer of livability, comfort, civility, but underneath you just know it's a track weapon waiting to detonate. Now heading out on track in the new Mk8 Golf GTI, and it's immediately apparent that there's been a change to the GTI formula, and for the better. This chassis is more mobile, more willing to move, more willing to wriggle its hips on lift-off oversteer, and keener to turn in with its nose as a result, and just it savours that transitional moment now. The previous car was very good at being a very neutral platform, and you had to sort of provoke it to have the most fun in the car. This, it just sort of feels like it's at that level already. I can't believe how much, whenever you're really on the brakes, that you can get this car to move around. Certainly to your benefit, you can really manipulate what the chassis is doing so much better. And you know, it's undeniable. It's a more involving, more exciting drive as a result. The 2-litre turbocharged petrol engine under the bonnet might be down on power in comparison to the Type R, but it's only about 30 Newton meters down on torque, and that means when it comes to really low speed corners, this almost feels a match for the mechanical grunt you need to slingshot you off down the next straight. Now, of course, the faster car is faster. We've timed these two, they're about 2 seconds a lap on this technical circuit apart, which is a good amount, but you could argue that maybe the Type R is in a slightly different performance bracket as a result. And actually, this base GTI now has the performance levels, from its engine at least, that the old performance pack had. And of course, there will be a performance version of this car too. Now really for this test we should be using the 6-speed manual transmission option, but that's coming a little bit later to the UK, so enthusiasts hold off who really want a manual. The 3-pedal car is on its way. In the meantime, we've got this 7-speed automatic, and I have to say, left to its own devices, it's pretty good around here, especially in sport mode. The changes are fast. It's actually quite tricky to trip the gearbox up intentionally. It knows what it's doing, it's well calibrated, and the shifts themselves are pretty seamless. Taking control via these wheel-mounted paddles, you'll find downshifts are a little bit hesitant, but generally speaking, it's fast enough to respond. It's not bad at all. It's undeniable the progress that's been made with the chassis of this car. It really is commendable. However, I have a slight issue with the steering. Even in its sport mode, I find that it's never quite heavy enough, never quite giving me that precision, but more importantly, the lack of feedback. I feel really detached from what's going on underneath the front wheels, and I find myself having to take a few bites of the cherry to gauge how much grip there is there. And that sort of just kills the driver involvement a little bit. This is undeniably the most civilized Golf GTI there has ever been. Settling down for a commute, the car is fantastic. It's got enough punch in that engine for strong motorway overtaking, but when you're cruising, it's quite quiet, it's quite refined in here. This car has the most basic suspension in it, so it hasn't got the clever adaptability. But even so, it's cosseting enough. It's more comfortable than the Type R in its comfort mode, marginally. Still a little bit choppy, but then, you know, it's give and take with a hot hatchback. And whilst the car does feel a bit out of its depth on track, on a B road, it comes alive much more, and I feel much more plugged into the car in that regard. But I do still think that added polish, that progress in terms of refinement, has somewhat come at the cost of driver involvement, and that's a bit of a shame. I really hate these sorts of conclusions, but which car is best ultimately comes down to how you are going to use it. The GTI is the most grown-up proposition it has ever been. It has more than enough performance to get you into trouble on public roads, and that chassis is even more playful than before. However, in becoming a more grown-up package, I do think it's lost a little bit of that cheekiness, that little bit of fun that the Mark 7.5 had. The Type R, well, that's the ultimate thrill seeker, isn't it? Its on-circuit performance is unrivaled, and its ability to munch B-roads for breakfast is incredible. It's certainly for extroverts, but it's fair to say that a Type R customer won't necessarily be looking at GTIs, and GTI customers certainly wouldn't consider a Type R. For me personally, a big aspect of the hot hatchback equation is bang for bucks, and it's undeniable that the Type R walks the GTI in that regard. The GTI is a really expensive car. It's more expensive than the Type R without options, and there are plenty of option boxes to tick for the GTI. It is the car that will impress your mother-in-law the most, but hot hatchbacks are all about rebellion. They're so anti-establishment. It's all about having your cake and eating it too, and not just eating it, but full-on scoffing it in front of everybody else's face. Embarrass the sports cars, buy a hot hatchback. And in that regard, the Type R's reign remains unchallenged. Head to YesAuto.com for the latest car news and reviews, and don't forget to check us out on social media. We're in all the usual places such as Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Simply search for YesAuto.